This is the second Grace Excels Bible study session. I want to zoom in a little bit more clearly than what was present at the end of the last session. And I've also come back and made some adjustments to the text that you might see here in change from the earlier passage where we concluded. All of these sessions are created with one take, no editing from start to finish. But there are going to be mistakes or corrections that need to be made to make things better. What I've done is I've reheaded this. Obviously, the study is Grace Excels Bible Study. And what this first section is John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. And I've been more explicit in saying this is John's overture because it's so magnificent in its opening 18 verses as the beginning of the gospel. I want to resist the words preface and introduction, although both of those are fine, or anything of the sort like that. But it seems to be something even more grand and more dramatic. And overture historically in music or in regards to the opera, that an overture contains all the elements that are going to be experienced in the opera. Even symphonies have become overtures in history. So I don't want to overstate the musical aspect of it, but it does seem to be something of that sort, that John's first 18 verses are so significant that they have to be looked upon as something tremendous and grand, magnificent. They are the revelation that comes from eternity that results in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. And that's the most significant thing that's happened in the world. To consider that God himself has become man, and then his story is told from his death and resurrection and what it means for mankind. So what I've done is I've also added from the chart, which ended the last session, the 7 stanzas of grace outlined around 2 columns, verse 1 through verse 8 of chapter 1, and then verse 9 through 15. I had mistakenly said 1 and 3. I've gone back and corrected that. So the first and the fourth sections are detailed in word to light and light to life. And then 2 and 5, means and results, are seen in 3 and 5 and 10 through 13. And then finally, section 3, which is John's testimony, and section 6, which is also John's testimony, which compels me, others aren't as quick to do so, but it compels me to say that there's a comparison to be drawn here, that he is going to testify, the word is used twice in 6 through 8, and he's going to bear witness to the identity and the eternality of Jesus in his humanity. He's going to say, this is who I spoke. So I've tried to illustrate that. But John the Apostle, not the Baptist, but John the Apostle then sets aside 3 verses, seen here, 16 through 18, to then draw a conclusion from the 2 earlier sections, as I've noted here, that Jesus Christ is grace exceptional, grace upon grace. That what we saw in Moses was the law, but grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. And that Jesus has explained God the Father. No one has seen God, but the only begotten who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. Every time Jesus is challenged by his activity or his announcements, he will go to great lengths to explain his relationship to the Father. He claims to be, I and the Father are one, as we'll see in John chapter 10. This was very offensive to the Jews, but it's a demonstration that Jesus is the revelation of God to the world. Now, that has a lot to be said, and a lot can be done, and ought to be done, to further one's study of what John has shown here in these first 3 sections, or in these second 3 sections that conclude then with this 7th section. And the theme is going to reoccur that 6 is the anticipation of the seventh. And I hope to be able to show that throughout all the sections that we study when it's appropriate. It needs to be shown that John is actually really clear and intentional, and this session is the comparison between John 1 through 18 and Genesis 1. So I'd like to revisit the first verse and to show that John has, with intentionality, connected his opening overture to what was written in Genesis chapter 1. So John 1:1 reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The Greek text, which I've listed here, begins in arche. The Greek language here is repetitive in terms of, not repetitive, it's not the right word, but is related to in the beginning. This idea of archein being beginning and in as the preposition. Ha logos, in the beginning was, this is the verb, so the transliteration is just was the word. Kai, this Greek word, is the connective, is going to be represented by the word in English and. We'll see it again here, and, with this kai. So we can see ha logos, en pros ton theon. The idea here is the Word was with God. This is the idea of with God. And then finally the conclusion, the ha logos moves to the end of the Greek sentence. It's at the beginning because English reads differently than Greek, but nevertheless it's the same idea. Ha logos, here's the verb, was God. We don't see was the God or a God, but was God. So it's the deity of the Word. It's going to be very significant, as we've already seen. John is going to unfold his gospel, where ultimately in verse 14 of chapter 1, the Logos, the Halogos, becomes flesh. So Jesus incarnate, God incarnate. John has used in archein just like the Septuagint did, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Greek translation, the Septuagint, for Genesis 1:1 is in archein. Same word. You can see, same phrase, same two words. Now the rest of the passage in Genesis 1:1 is different, because it would read, in the beginning, halogos, which is God, created or made the heavens. Kai is the word and in English again. We've seen it twice earlier. The heavens and the earth. Both of these have the article, being very specific. So what that takes us to is that if we were to go back to Genesis, and I've added these things already just for the sake of time, is that Genesis chapter 1:1 is a title. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is a decision made by me, that this is not the initiative or the initial creative events of God, but it's a title to the book, that God is the responsible one who created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, and I've once again titled this differently than the New American Standard or other versions, because the conditions of the earth, the heavens are not talked about here, but the conditions of the earth are odd for God's creative and actually in opposition to God's normal creative pattern. Notice that the earth, if God created it, the earth's condition was formless and void. This phrase, and I won't go into the Hebrew, but this phrase is indicative of chaos. This leads to some initial problems. If God created the heavens and the earth was chaotic, it's contrary to God's nature. God brings order out of chaos. But nevertheless, the earth was formless and void in the telling of the story. Darkness, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. Two words, darkness and deep, are two words that are foreboding, and they are not what God creates in his initial fiat. They are results of what God does with regard to judgment. So there's something odd about the conditions at the beginning of the story in Genesis chapter 1. So what we see is we see chaos, we see darkness. The deep here doesn't have a moral implication to it, but we do know that the deep after the flood was judgment. We also know that the deep in regards to the Jonah story is indicative of the judgment of the prophet who was disobedient to not follow what God had told him to do, which was preach to Nineveh. So the Old Testament is replete with examples of the deep being evidence of the absence of God or the judgment of God. So it's quite odd to see it here. And then finally we see the Spirit of God, which is his presence clearly, because it was moving over the surface, of the waters. So this water, the earth in its condition, is formless and void. It's chaotic. It's dark. It's foreboding in its depth. And then there's this surface, but the Spirit of God is there, and there is either moving or hovering over the surface of the water. In spite of these conditions, God's presence is there. I have offered a third title, that the beginning of the creation story as told to us in Genesis chapter 1 really begins in verse 3. And it's going to, over the next chapter, the conclusion of chapter 1 and the first 3 verses in chapter 2, is going to undo the conditions that are told in verse 2. So from the very beginning, and this theme is picked up by John, that the light came into the world and the darkness could not comprehend it, could not subdue it. So the ideas of light and darkness are in John's gospel. I want to position that the reason John said that by the inspiration of the Spirit is because that's the condition that was present in Genesis. So God the Son creates the heavens and the earth, which are then fallen. This verse 2 seems to describe a fallen condition or a judged world that God is going to then address. And out of this chaos, he's going to bring order in the natural world. So in contrast to darkness, God is going to speak and create light. So in verse 3 we see God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning the first day, or one day. I'd like to note that what God is going to do in terms of the specificity of the conditions, he's also going to address and correct and fix what is wrong in terms of the structure of the world. The earth was formless and void. So beginning with the creation story in verse 3, the first day, and following all subsequent days, which all the text is here, he's going to undo this chaos by bringing order to the formlessness and void. And the first thing he does is to bring light into the darkness. That's the first day. The second day, verse 6. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, the second day. This idea of the waters is again addressed here as response to moving over the surface of the waters. There's a separation vertically above and below, the second day. The third day, beginning in verse 9. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and gathering of the waters he called seas. God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind, and God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, the third day. Now we move to verse 14, the fourth day. You'll notice God said, "Let there be lights." We saw earlier in verse 3, "Let there be light." So he returns to the theme of lights. with more specificity, because now there are lights rather than just simply light. Notice the plural. More specifically, reading, "Then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. It's assumed here in verse 16 that the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day would be the sun, and the lesser light to govern the night would be the moon, plus the stars. So then in verse 17, God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness, and God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, a fourth day. I'd like to say now, it seems to be very clear that from verses 14 through 19, there is a smaller division and explanation about light, both what is true in the day, what is true at night, that there is the ever-presence of light in the darkness. There is the separation of day and night. There is the creation of the signs and the seasons and the days and years. But these lesser lights and these stars and all that sort of thing seems to be a more great detail about the differentiation between the light and the darkness that we'd seen earlier in verse 2 and 3. So it appears to me that day 1 and day 4 are parallels with each other. Continuing, verse 20, in day 5. "Then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. God created the great sea monsters, and every living thing that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. There was evening, there was morning, a fifth day." Seems to be, once again, that when God had created the expanse in the midst of waters and the separation, and we see these things above and below, which is the air above and the waters below, this expanse called heaven, in day 2, once again, this day 5 seems to be paralleling day 2. It's a filling in of the form from day 2. Now, verse 24. "Then God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after their kind. And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good." You'll note that this is an expanded day, because in verse 26 he continues, "Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness." We've seen over and over and over the reference after their kind. Creeping things of the earth after their kind. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind. The cattle after their kind. Everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. In other words, there is a form, or there is an idea that is replicated in the earth. The natural world is replicated after its kind. We get into now, man, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. It's not the same phrase after their kind, but there's something about deity that is replicated in man. The idea, our image, our likeness. So man reflects the image of God, Imago Dei. And let them, notice man is singular here, but the let them is plural, rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. This is the divine declaration. Let us do this. And now we see the activity. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them male and female. He created them. So man here is singular. We now note that in the image of God, he created him, singular, but now in a change, male and female, he created them. So man is understood in the more general sense. The image of God is represented as man, understood as male and female. So once created, then verse 28, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Then God said, behold, I've given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which have life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. This is a long section, which began in verse 24. So the sixth day has more verses in chapter 1 than any other, because it includes not only the creation of animals, it also includes the creation of man, understood as male and female. And then we see authority given to this couple over the world. Day 6, if I might go ahead and jump ahead, is paralleled with day 3, where we see the waters below, and we see the dry land, we see the gathering of the waters into the seas, we see the earth sprouting vegetation, brought forth vegetation, so on and so forth. What we see here again, the earth, the land has been set up, and in day 6 we see its filling. Now, for the last 3 verses of this particular section, the creation of man and woman, which is a title from the New American Standard editors, which I'm going to delete, because I want to look to now the conclusion of this particular creation story. So we read, thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their host. By the 7th day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the 7th day, sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. I'd like to offer that in this section of Genesis, and if now I can borrow the outline of the chart that I had created earlier from John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, I want to offer that I see a parallel in the structure around which John was reflecting the same thing that was present in Genesis. In these columns, which is the first section, what I saw to be a problem from Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, that there was formlessness and void, I see in days 1 through 3 that God created form. And then, as are the parallels that I've mentioned as I was going through this, then in days 4 through 6, God provided the filling. So where there was formlessness, God gave us form, and when there was void, God gave us filling. So I'm going to now draw the same thing I'd done earlier with 1 and 4, this time being correct, day 2 and day 5, and day 3 and day 6. And then on day 7, which we've just seen, is the Sabbath. God rested. So I'd like to go back now, and I can do this at the end, just so for the simplicity of it all, that Genesis, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, is the institution of the Sabbath. It's not a Jewish law thing. It's actually from the very beginning in creation. But I'm going to have to back up just for the sake of making this faster, but I'd like to consider the days of creation as the title, because those are the 7 days of creation. Now, scanning back to the top, I see the first day, so that's going to be Genesis 1, 3 through 5. So down toward the bottom, I want to put in here Genesis 1, 3 through 5 is day 1. I'm going to continue with this to day 2, which is 6 through 8. Scanning back down to the bottom. 1, 6 through 8. And then we're looking for day 3, which is here, 9 through 13. You can see the section 9 through 13. So 1, 9 through 13. Now I want to move over to see the parallels between, and I've mentioned this earlier, but I'd like to show the parallels between days 1 and 4. So moving back up, having highlighted the text, let's go back, I've lost it there. I see that verses 14 through 19 is day 4. So 14 through 19. Moving down, I'm looking for day 5, which is going to be verses 20 through 23. And now I know that I can conclude that day 6, as I mentioned earlier, being the longest, is verse 24 through, and I can see this at the top of the text, verse 31. So what I have here is a conclusion that Genesis chapter 1 and the way in which Moses wrote it is to show that in the creation story, beginning in verse 3, God is undoing the world of chaos, those conditions that were present in verse 2 at the telling of the story. And the structures of, as I want to highlight here, this particular column, verses 3 through 13, which is the form, which answers the question of formlessness, is paralleled by this structure here, this column, which is the filling, which answers the question of void. And finally, these 6 elements, these 6 days, this natural, is complete, but not finished. It was good. Each one of these was good. But there was something that needed to be done on top of that, and it's the 7th day, and this is the divine. And this is the Sabbath, the day in which God rested. So the pattern that we see in the Gospel of John is that in every case, we're going to see that 6 is replaced, or not replaced, but 6 is insufficient. It comes up wanting. It comes up lacking. There's something else that needs to be known. And that 7th is Jesus Christ. So going back to our earlier chart, seeing the parallels with Genesis, the opening 18 verses of John, in my judgment, follows the same pattern of Genesis chapter 1. And the same process, the parallels are present, and the 6 elements which are described, both of which have endings testified and witnessed to by John the Baptist, set everyone up for the next thing that happens, which is the 7th thing, and that is the revelation of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I want to make sure that this is done in context, that the pattern that John had established in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, intentionally took us to Genesis chapter 1. And in so doing, if I'm correct in being able to draw out the parallels, what we see, and will continue to see in the next few sessions, is that John has built the opening overture of his gospel around the opening overture of creation. The climax of each is the revelation of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the light of the world, that has come into the darkness, and that by believing in him, you might be saved. I'd like to conclude our session. Hope to have you at the next.